So essentially, this is a distinction that I started to make back in 2008 after my very first 5-MeO experience. And this is also right around the same time that I started using the name of this is the God molecule for
Mm,
5-MeO.
mm, mm,
Just a tiny little bit of backstory around that is that at that time, most people had never heard of 5-MeO DMT. It was
mm,
still just radically unknown in the psychedelic world. But a lot of people were very familiar with DMT. It had been highly popularized back in 2008. You know, Rick Strassman, Terence
yes,
McKenna,
yes.
fascination with ayahuasca, DMT entities, and stuff like that. And it already had the name of the spirit molecule.
Mm.
And when I would mention 5-MeO DMT, many people would say, well, you mean DMT?
DMT, yeah.
No, no, 5-MeO DMT is something fundamentally different. So um, for one, it was strategic that I'm going to use the phrase the God molecule to
Mm,
both reference the spirit, DMT as the spirit molecule, and also distinguish it from that, and also encoding linguistically that, in my opinion, there's something much more profound going on here with 5-MeO.
mm,
That here we have
mm,
spirits versus this is God.
mm,
And it was really at that point where I started adopting the language of non duality to help people understand linguistically how we can talk about and differentiate. We could just use DMT as the example, where with DMT, we're taking a molecule that, for the most part, does not dissolve the ego. It might alter the ego,
mm,
and in many cases actually amplifies the ego.
mm,
And it was also at this point that I started to really characterize that the ego is not just our individuated sense of self. So through psychology, most people have a very personalized notion of what the ego is. It's like, oh, it's me and my sense of self. And so what I started to talk about at that point in time is saying it's not just you and your sense of self, that the ego is actually you and your sense of self in context and in relation to everything that you think is not you and is somehow fundamentally other.
mm,
Here, like I used Terence McKenna's language, when Terence McKenna would talk about DMT, he'd say it is the ultimate experience of otherness, meaning this acute and heightened awareness that whatever the hell this is that I'm experiencing, this is not me. This is not
mm,
familiar. This is unknown. This is pure otherness.
mm,
That's what I mean, that actually DMT is actually amplifying the ego because it's creating the sense of I'm a witness or a perspective that is in relationship and context to all of these entities and machine elves and spirits and realms, and it's filled with content. And I think that from a phenomenological perspective, one of the reasons that DMT does that so very well is that it is probably, or at least ranks somewhere near the top in terms of visual phenomenon from the production of a psychedelic experience. So
mm,
the visual nature of DMT goes on overdrive. It's hyper defined, hyper realistic,
okay.
super saturated in color and brightness. And the phenomenon of me seeing something reinforces that distinction between subject and object and the perceiver
Mm,
and that which is perceived.
yes.
And though non-dual experience or the dissolution between subject and object and those polar identities, while that experience is possible in any context or with any psychedelic substance or no psychedelic substance, it's actually extraordinarily rare for that experience to happen. It
Mm,
very rarely happens spontaneously. And, you know, in my analysis of people's DMT trips, for example, like reading through Rick Strassman's book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, there was only one instance that I could find in the book, and that also was included in the movie, where one of the participants said they dissolved into a golden light, they perceived it
mm,
as God and unitary being. It lasted only a few split seconds, and then they very quickly dropped down out of that state.
mm,
So that in most circumstances, in most psychedelics, the duality of subject object relationship is actually preserved and amplified, even though the ego might be profoundly altered during those experiences. But there's still a perspective that is seeing something. So that's what the ego is doing. It's creating me in the context of everything that I'm also categorizing as not me, not self, or as
Yeah.
other. Now, I've also talked about it that the ego itself is merely a collection of patterns of energy with which we have habitually identified. And I can explain more about that at any point if you like. But because it's this collection of patterns of energy, that the evolutionary job of the ego is to maintain resilience and coherency across a spectrum of energetic environments and
Mm.
experiences. So, in other words, you don't want to lose your ego when the tiger is running at you. You want to be able to
Yeah.
say, oh shit, there's a tiger.
Yeah.
I'm terrified. It's going to eat me. I need to run away. So, the ego is, as an evolutionary product, it's very, very hard to actually fully disrupt the ego through all kinds of experiences and events. It needs to be resilient so that we maintain that from just a self-preservation perspective. And then
Yeah.
also psychologically, as a self-aware animal, that the ego also is resilient energetically because we do maintain an identity over time and across circumstances, and that's what allows us to function as social animals. Like if we were all
Mm.
dissolving our egos all the time, we wouldn't be the social animals that we are, but we
Mm.
are. So that it's just the way that the ego functions. So another way of describing that is that it takes a massive energetic input to effectively override the habitual energetic patterns of the ego. And probably this is the older we get, probably the more true that is, because
Mhm.
patterns become more well ingrained within our neurobiology, within our habitual psychology. So even DMT, even though it's extraordinarily powerful and it presents as energetically quite intense, it's still pretty mild compared to 5-MeO DMT.
Yes.
So, and this is something that I find to be particularly true with the vaporized inhalation of 5-MeO,
Hmm.
where the onset is so rapid and so incredibly intense that it actually produces something of a crisis situation for the ego, where
Mm.
in the face of this massive energetic expansion and onslaught, whether the ego is aware of it or not, it's presented with a fundamental choice. And the choice is there's not much I can do about this, so I'm just going to let go. And there, from the phenomenological description or labeling would be that's the ego death experience. And if there is able to be a energetic consent within the being within the body, then the ego just
Mm.
goes away and it completely
Mm.
dissolves. And then we go into a phenomenological state, which is unitary, infinite, eternal, right? The normal categories of dualistic awareness, they no longer apply within that context. However, there's always the possibility that a deep seated aspect of the ego, which might be at the conscious level, but more often is at a deep rooted unconscious level, perhaps as a protective mechanism to compensate for some kind of trauma, or, there's all kinds of psychological reasons. But if there is a no that exists within the person, then the experience doesn't go into the non dual state. It doesn't go into an ego dissolution. Um, it might dissolve various layers of the ego. So I've been doing this with my hands for almost 20 years now. So let's say the ego is just a collection of these patterns of energy, ways I think, ways I act, ways I express myself, ways I carry my body, right? All these patterns that collectively give the impression I am this character, right?
Mm.
And here's where I like to bring in like people who do impressions, right? So an actor
Yes.
who does an impression, what they're going to do is, and I don't mean anything metaphysical by this, but they exhibit what we can call energetic shape shifting, where they take, okay, this is my normal character, but I don't do any impressions. Like Uh, I'm trying to think like, oh, can I bring one out? But anyway, to impersonate someone else, what we're doing is we're adopting facial expressions, body postures and movements, tone of voice, style of speaking. And when
Mm,
we adopt those fully, then we can appear as someone else, right? We're doing an impression, and we're not
mm,
we're not physically shape shifting. We're just
mm,
energetically shape shifting, where I'm now adopting the energetic patterns of this character, and by adopting them and performing them, I appear as this other person, right? So that's how we accomplish, quote, doing an impression.
yeah.
Um, so anyway, these patterns of energy, going back to 5-MeO, we might dissolve some of the surface patterns, but if there's something deep rooted where it says, no, this
Mm,
experience is terrifying, I need to hold on, I
yeah.
cannot let go,
Yeah.
then it doesn't actually go into a non dual experience. It just goes into the most energetically amplified experience a person could go through. And some part of the ego is still there saying, oh my God, this is terrifying.
Mm,
And that might last for a while, but there's still the possibility that that portion of the ego might eventually decide, okay, I'm going to let go, and then they can let go. So it can transfer into a non dual experience. But if not, then it's usually just perceived as that was harrowing, that was traumatic, that was challenging. And then the more conscious parts of the ego start to come on. So I'll give you just a very clear example of this. One of the things that I've seen is that often it can be difficult for people who still have dependent children. It
mm,
can be challenging for them to let go into a 5-MeO experience because at the surface level, they say, I want this, I am choosing this, I intend to let go,
mm,
I intend to surrender and dissolve. But as these things are breaking apart and as this ego death experience is unfolding, and it's important to note that when the ego death experience occurs, no amount of rational thought is going to override the immediate perception at the phenomenological level that this is happening, that it's permanent, and that
mm,
there's that it can never be undone. So in other words, as the ego is dissolving, the ego thinks, "Oh shit, I've done it now. I'm dying and I'm never coming back from this." So if you have small children, this part of the ego says, "But I'm never going to see my kids again."
mm,
And maybe that means I'm a bad mom or I'm a bad dad, that I've chosen this and I'm abandoning my children. So a
mm.
deep part of the self might say, no, you can't do this
No,
right
you
now.
can't let go. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is where I do like to say that even as powerful as 5-MeO is, because this is only an amplification of the self, it cannot violate your free will. It's not possible for it to do it because it is you at the deepest
Mm,
levels. It's just you.
mm,
And so if part
mm,
of you says, no, I can't go, then that part of the self is going to hold on. And that's where then the conscious ego might even come back and say, wait, no, make it stop. I can't abandon my children. But if someone rests within that process and then a deep part of them says, okay, I love my kids, but realistically, I'm not going to be here forever anyway. This is happening now. Okay, I let go. So maybe I'm over rationalizing that, but it's still just because there's a block doesn't mean that it can't then be further dissolved and that person might let go.
mm,
So in this process, because it's dissolving the structures of the ego and potentially completely dissolving the structures of the ego, that is why at one level it's not likely to produce a lot of content,
mm.
particularly for an ego that is able to let go immediately.
Yes.
And with many egos, they fundamentally let go within a few seconds of having inhaled. And it
Mm,
might even be so sudden that, like for me, is what I like to call my first full experience with 5-MeO DMT came with pure freebase 5-MeO in January of 2008. And even as I was taking the hit in, I
mm-hmm.
didn't even get the whole thing in. I'm taking it in, and I could tell, oh my God,
Yeah.
something really profound is happening. And then it was just
Yes.
instantly.
Yeah.
But if and when the ego is holding on at some level, that's when we do have the possibility of having some forms of content take place. But it's not usually in the same capacity as, say, DMT, where it's often more presented as a feeling. So, for
Mm,
example, if somebody's having a really traumatic, difficult experience, they might say, well, it felt like I went to hell
mm,
and I was being tortured and it was awful. But if you ask them, well, were there demons? Did you see flames? They would often say, look, no, there wasn't anything there. It was the feeling, this overwhelming feeling.
mm,
Versus
mm.
with DMT, this is where people will describe demons, flame,
Yeah.
hell. There's
Yeah.
lots of content. And um, beyond the ego level, I think from a phenomenological profile, 5-MeO just doesn't really present as visual for the most part.
Yeah.
I do like to say that it does have what I call a translucent fractal lattice structure, meaning that
Mm,
there is a
mhm,
complex fractal geometry to the experience,
mm.
but it's translucent in the sense that normally you see through it, you don't see it. And
Yes.
where we get kind of a more interesting visual presentation, quite interestingly, is either on the way up to the peak or on the way back down on what I call the backside of the peak, where either the ego is dissolving at that initial onset or the ego is reintegrating and reforming after the peak. Here is where we often see descriptions from people where they are having visual phenomenon, but it's not inside of consciousness in terms of like closed eyes, visuals
Mm,
happening, but it actually gets projected outwards.
mhm.
So, for example, if somebody takes a hit and then suddenly thinks, this was a mistake, this was a bad idea, something that happens is that um, people then might look at the person who served them or is facilitating for them, and then they will describe that person looked like a demon.
Mm,
And
mhm,
actually, they won't say it that way. They will say, and that person was a demon.
mhm.
So they might be looking directly at you, but they're not actually seeing you. There's this subtle fractal matrix that kind of goes and
Yeah.
subtly manipulates your facial expression so that now
Mhm,
you look to that person, you look like a demon.
mm,
And then often on the backside, as the ego is reintegrating, and the person then opens their eyes or they start to look around because now the ego is trying to reestablish subject object relationship. So the ego is saying, what's that? Who's that? Where am I? Who am I? And
mm,
creating that subject object duality.
mm,
Then,
mm.
so for example, these were things that I heard from my own clients back when I was
Yeah.
a facilitator. They said, you were a demon, you were an insect alien, you were a lizard person, you were a bear, you were a wolf, you were an eagle, you were Jesus, you were God, you were some kind of angelic being, you were me, you were my mother, you were my father, you were my husband, you were my wife, you were my brother, you were my sister.
Mm,
And often when the ego is doing this, particularly on the backside, because again, the ego is trying to reestablish a sense of self in context of someone else, that we can see rapid shape shifting taking place at that time, where
mm,
people will say, I was looking at you, but your face was morphing through multiple different personas.
mm, mm.
And that just shows how quickly the ego is trying to like, how do I figure this out? How do I figure this out?
Yes.
Who am I? But again, it's usually not content inside the experience itself.
Yeah.
And then again, we tend to see content on the way up and on the way down. But if somebody does reaches the infinite state of the non-dual state of awareness, there the more common descriptors are just infinite emptiness or this
Mm,
strange paradox of all possible choices, manifestations, and possibilities, yet no particular thing.
Yeah.
And it's all perceived as this is the self, this is what I am, or this is the fundamental nature of being, the fundamental nature of consciousness. But
Yeah.
it's often contentless. And people might say, well, it was this amazing light.
Yes.
It was white, it was golden. Often people describe it as kind of having like rainbow refractions out on the edges, but it's translucent. And so, again, it's more perceived as a feeling than it is
Yeah.
an object of awareness.
Yeah.
But without an ego, it's not really possible to perceive anything other than this profound sense of what I would call the ultimate self recognition, right? So, another common descriptor that people give after the peak is they might say, well, that was God, or that was pure consciousness, or that was the fundamental nature of being, and say, and it was me. That's what I fundamentally am.
Mm.
And that somehow I'm both that and I'm this person and this ego and identity. But it leaves people in a state of like, so then who am I really?
Mm.
Um, but that's those are all the reasons why I think it's fundamentally contentless for the most part, with
Yeah.
recognizing that it depends on the phase of the experience and it does depend on how much someone has fundamentally let go within their ego versus some aspect of them that might be holding on and trying to create relationship, narrative, and sense of me and whatever else
Mm.
it is that I think I'm perceiving and experiencing now. I would say for most people, it's not a fundamental block. Um, that particularly if somebody who is offering the session, the person who is facilitating, if
Mm.
they can give useful feedback and advice to the person, and then also if they are willing and able to help guide them through physical cues, you can really fundamentally help people reach a state of non-dual absorption.
Mm.
Um, and that my model, when I was working, so this was the summer of 2009 to the summer of 2016. Well, I was providing what I called non-dual energetic therapy or non-dual energetic work using 5-MeO.
Mm.
And also, I would use other psychedelics depending on what the client was asking for. And sometimes we could do it without any psychedelics. But for the most part, people wanted to experience 5-MeO. Then I
Yeah.
worked on this model of I will offer you 3 full rounds of medicine over the course of our session. So, what we're looking for is ideally, yes, we're looking for completely dissolving the ego and going into the non dual state. But short of that, what we're emphasizing is we want to make sure that you are energetically processing through your experience. And
Mm.
if the full letting go happens, great. If not, it's about working with what we have so that we can see this energetic event through with the least amount of egoic interference as possible. So, for example, let's just say it shows up as someone with that same example that I gave of, oh, I can't have this experience now because I'm never going to see my kids again. And
Mm.
that will present as very real in the moment, but eventually the psychedelic is going to wear off, within about 20 minutes. And then at that point, you can actually give some coaching to someone and talk to them like, so what did you experience? They're like, oh, I thought I was never going to see my kids again. Okay, so we're going to take it again. And it's going to seem like that. You now have experienced that you do come back from it. But in the moment, you're not going to be
Yes.
able to
Yes.
rationalize that. You're not going to be able to
Yes.
say, well, I just did this 20 minutes ago and I did come back, so I'm just overreacting. No, that's a natural experience in the moment. But it's helping someone to recognize that you can choose to let your kids go.
Mm.
And yeah, it's going to present like you're never going to see them again. And I know that that's a deep fear for you, but we're going to do this again. And if that comes up, I would invite you just to say, okay, I'm going
Mhm.
to let them go. So that's at the mental level. But there might also be something that's presenting physically. And this is a place that actually is a bit more direct. So I'll do a little enactment for you. So someone takes a hit,
Mm.
they've been instructed to lie down, they take their hit, they lie down, but then within a couple seconds, like, no, no, my kids, right? Often, if there's some kind of resistance, it actually is acted out by the person in the
Mm.
moment.
Mm.
They're not choosing to do that. It's just they can't help it. They're acting it out. So if, let's say, someone is doing something like that, or if they get up and they say, no, no, you make it stop, make it stop. What I would
Mm.
advise for that person is let's say they were really physically active, a lot of looking around, a lot of exclaiming. I'd say, okay, so this time also we're going to take a hit, and I'm just going to sit right in front of you, and I'm going to hold your hands. And it's okay. You can have all of these feelings, you can have all these thoughts, but what I want you to do is just focus on me right here. You don't have to look me in the eye, you can look me in the forehead, and you don't even have to look at me. I'm just asking you to focus.
Mm.
And rather than letting yourself, whoa, get all agitated, I'm just going to help hold you right here
Mm.
so that you can go into the experience, and this is going to help you not react to it in the same
Mm.
way. And that by doing that, you might find that you were more easily able to dissolve beyond that point. Okay?
Mm.
So these are just two very general examples, but that
Yeah, great
with
examples.
with proper guidance and with proper feedback and coaching, you can definitely help people reach a deeper level of the experience. But they need to
Mm.
be open to that. And also, there's the reality that some people, like if they had a really difficult experience where they were resisting, it can be hard for someone to choose to do it again.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But this is why I always like to put the emphasis on we want to emphasize the process, not the experience, not
Mm.
what you think is happening.
Mm.
And so, in a case like this, if somebody was not able to let go and the ego was busy interfering with the experience, that if someone leaves and doesn't continue the work at that point, it's like the snow globe, right? Or, okay, now we've shaken out your snow globe and everything is up in the air and you want to leave. But
Mm.
by continuing to work, we're actually giving the possibility that the snow can settle. But if
Mm.
you leave a session completely dysregulated, that tends to lead to a very difficult after period. So even in the moment,
Mm.
the person's like, oh, thank goodness I don't need to do that again. I'm just going to go home. They're almost always going to be having a difficult time in the next days
Mm.
and weeks
Mm.
because this deep part of their ego got triggered with a traumatic response of I need to protect myself from this, and that's going to be
Mm.
on overdrive in the days and
Mm.
weeks to come. So that's where, from a therapeutic sense, if we focus on let's get you through this process, it might not get you all the way to the non-dual experience, but let's go ahead and confront this fear and see if we can move beyond it and then see what might be underneath that. Let that
Mm.
process through. It's intense and it's grueling in the therapeutic event, but it's going to make for a much, much easier time
Yes.
post session, which is very
Yeah.
important because 5-MeO does not end when the molecule has been metabolized. It's all of those things. Um,
Great.
yeah, I'd say that the question is a little bit reductive. I think it's a
Mm.
completely reasonable question, and
Yeah.
certainly different facilitators coming from a different perspective and different background will
Mm.
have a different take on how they want to emphasize what is going on. And I don't think that they're exclusive. So, for example, we could look at it as a neurobiological event.
Mm.
Um, so, at lower doses, 5-MeO tends to send people into delta and theta waves, which is
Mm.
much more common with most other psychedelics, right? When people say, well, it was like a dreamlike state.
Mhm.
And that dreamlike state is disruptive to the default mode network so that we
Yeah.
form new associations, we have new thoughts like, oh, I can think about this in a different way. I've always been of the perspective that I'm not really interested in low dose 5-MeO experiences.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah. Um, I think they're great. I've always been of the position that have a full release experience first.
Mm.
Then lower doses are way more interesting.
Mm.
So
Good point. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that for many people, lower doses, because it still presents as energetically highly charged, for a lot of people, it tends to aggravate the ego rather than relieve the ego because there's just such a strong sense of like, whoa, this is really powerful. And then the ego is like, what am I supposed to do?
Mm.
So a lot of people describe early small doses as just fundamentally very, very uncomfortable. And then once they get to
Yeah.
the full release dose, they're like, oh, okay, I can relax with this. I mean, it's this weird paradox.
Yeah.
But anyway, lower level doses tend towards theta and delta waves, but the full release dose tends towards gamma waves. And these are the uh, fastest, most highly coherent waves of energy that the brain could produce. And it tends to be more global, where it's like there's this gamma
Mm.
phenomenon, which again correlates with the complete dissolution of the ego, not just the alteration or loosening of the ego, the complete dissolution, like it's gone for that time period. And so if we were taking a strict neurobiological approach, we could say, yeah, there's certain health benefits, there's therapeutic benefits to that. Um, then if we were going from just the psychological perspective, we could say, well, look, this is a way of getting the regulator function of the ego out of the way so that unconscious materials can process to the surface, and that might facilitate the release of stored traumatic emotional energies that are lodged within the body. And I think this is a totally accurate description for 5-MeO.
Mm. Mm.
And that has therapeutic value. And
Mm-hmm.
so both these two, certainly psychiatrists and therapists, they're going to be a lot more comfortable using that kind of language. And I think that they're totally accurate. But the ontological level is there's only one universal consciousness and being that is all of space, all of time, all of reality, and that it is parceled out into subject and object and evolved itself into these self-aware animals that produce this self-aware concept that says, I am me in the context of a strange universe. But then
Mm.
we can dissolve that to have the immediate apprehension of, oh shit, it's all me,
Yeah.
one universal being and consciousness that
Mm.
is all of reality. And
Mm.
that's the side that I fundamentally landed on from my
Yeah.
first experience, and why I started using the term God for that. But I always like to say that for myself, I came to that not from a religious perspective, but as from the perspective of someone who is interested in the question, what's real? What's really going on here? What is the nature of reality? So,
Mm.
and like I've written in my book on 5-MeO integration, I have an appendix of theology versus entheology. And I do say,
Mm.
like, look, this might just be a psychological artifact of the mind. But I think it actually points to this is the nature of reality, that this is
Mm.
something ontological, and that because whether it's just a psychological artifact or if it's the nature of reality itself, given that people tend to perceive and appreciate it as being the nature of reality, we might as well as just treat it as such.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that we can't prove anything because all experience is mediated through our own consciousness. We can't prove anything other than that I'm experiencing.
Mm.
That's
Mm.
the only thing we can actually prove.
Yeah.
But given that this is one of the things that I found fascinating about 5-MeO, that you can take anyone, in theory, from any cultural, religious, political, socioeconomic background, and if they actually do dissolve their ego, they will all come back from it saying the same fundamental thing. And I think that that is profoundly interesting. Yeah, that it, what, for me, what it reveals is that underneath appearances,
Mm,
there really is one universal consciousness, being, and self. And we are
yeah.
all that. And that, so one of the ways I describe it is that there are billions of characters simultaneously playing out their parts, but there's only one actor. Yet that one actor only experiences itself as one character at a time. I mean, it's
Mm,
amazing. Yet
mm,
when we dissolve the character, any person from any background can say, I think it was me, or I think it was God. I think that because within non-duality, there's not this, that, or the other thing. It's the totality. And therefore, it's really this profound universal experience.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
that when someone can have that experience, it can fundamentally change and impact their sense of who they are, what reality is, what's true versus what's not true, and also gives really deep insight into how the ego actually functions at a personal and then also potentially a universal level. So I'll kind of start with the end first.
Okay.
So one of the things that I've long maintained, and again, this comes from my own personal experience, that first experience in January of 2008, that I
Mm,
wanted to start talking about this as a fundamental and universal human right, in the sense that, look, we are all people on this planet, and
mm,
we all have an ego, and we all have the question of who am I, where am I, what's going on here, who's in charge, what's the nature of reality.
yeah.
Whether or not people are aware that they ask those questions, humans have been asking those questions for thousands of years, and that's how we
Mm,
generated religion and politics and philosophy and metaphysics and all the rest of that. That these are deep, fundamental human questions.
mm,
And that, in my opinion, a direct and immediate experience with 5-MeO DMT fundamentally answers all of those questions simultaneously. So I
mm,
think that as a universal human right, every human being has the fundamental right to have this direct experience of the nature of self and the nature of reality. So within that, I'd like to say, at a general level, anyone who has been educated about what 5-MeO is, how it works, what are the potential dangers, what are the potential benefits, and if they say, yes, I'd like to have this experience, I
mhm,
think that they have a fundamental right to have that
mm.
experience. Now, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good idea. So,
Yes.
in terms of medical, like physical medical conditions, it can be very taxing on the heart. And here,
Yes.
given my level of experience, that I can really confidently say that consumption of 5-MeO does not cause elevated blood pressure or an elevated heart rate. In other words, that is not produced by taking 5-MeO. However,
Mm,
because it is so profound, so
mm,
intense, and so shocking, most people will experience an elevated heart rate and
mm.
elevated blood pressure
Yes.
because the ego is reacting with like, oh my
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Um, in the same sense, we could say, like, look, jumping out of an airplane
Mm,
doesn't increase your heart rate or blood pressure.
mm.
Because if you were unconscious, we could push you out.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
It's your awareness of
Yeah.
the event taking place that you're like, oh, I'm really nervous about this. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it was the same way that most people will react, at least initially, with elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure. So that means anybody who has a heart condition in some capacity uh, it's potentially something that could trigger like a heart attack or some,
Mm.
some kind of cardiac event could be triggered by that. And that's where I think screening is definitely relevant and definitely
Yeah.
cautious. Um, but let's just imagine, and actually, I know of a case where this happened years ago, where a client said, "Look, I'm going to die in a couple months anyway. Like I'm headed towards that. I
Yeah.
understand that I might not return from a 5-MeO experience. I choose to have this experience." And then there was a facilitator who said, "Okay, I'll do that for you." And the
Mm.
guy didn't come back.
I see.
But that was an informed choice, right? The
Yeah.
person knew what they were getting into. And that, for me, he's exercising his fundamental universal right as a human being to say, I'm choosing to have this experience and I understand that it might kill me. I think in most circumstances, we don't need to worry about that. But again, that's why you need to have medical screening ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the psychological level, um, it definitely can be highly dysregulating and highly disruptive for people who are in any kind of current psychiatric distress, um,
Mm.
people who are exhibiting, some form of psychosis, people who are in, like, say, a manic episode. Um, but even there, I think we also want to come at it with a sense of, like in the United States, 5-MeO has become very, very popular among veterans.
Yes.
Veterans are the group with the highest rates of suicide in the United
Mm.
States.
Mm.
And the medical system would say, oh, don't ever do psychedelic therapy with somebody who's suicidal because they
Mm.
might get more suicidal. But these veterans, I mean, I've talked to a number of them, and they have just directly said, look, if somebody didn't serve me 5-MeO, I was going to go get the shotgun.
Wow.
So there, it's actually usually other vets who are serving the 5-MeO. So it's not therapists, it's not medical professionals, because
Yeah. Yeah.
ethically they're like, no, no, we can't do that. But it's other vets who are saying, yeah, brother, I love you. I don't want you to choose death. This is our
Yeah.
last Hail Mary. So they're
Yeah.
providing with that experience. And for the most part, the results seem to be very positive.
Yeah.
That's where I think the anecdotal information provides pretty good data that um, it generally can be safe to work with somebody who is severely traumatized, who is depressed, who might be suicidal, and that it
Mm.
actually could really profoundly alleviate those symptoms rather than exacerbate them. But this
Yes.
is where I like to work off of this idea of full disclosure and informed consent,
Yes.
meaning that anybody who works with 5-MeO, my strong preference is that they have been educated and informed. This is what it is. This is what it
Mm.
does. This is how it can be terrifying. This is how it can be beautiful. And that letting them make an informed choice to say, okay,
Mm.
I understand the risks. I understand that the doctors don't want me to do it. I'm choosing to do it anyway. Um, but that is, again, that's full disclosure and informed consent, not just somebody saying, hey, this is a beautiful and amazing experience. I think you
Mm.
should have it. Oh, okay. It's like, we got to learn about it first and then decide,
Yeah.
yes, I'm choosing that for myself.
Yeah.
But, um, so outside of someone who's perhaps in the middle of a psychotic break, that I'd like to allow the possibility that, in a point where they're perhaps more stable, okay, I mean, if you understand that this might, like, for example, right now, I have an email that came in this morning
Mm.
of someone who says, so I haven't answered him yet, but he said
Mm.
that he did have a psychotic break. And that he says he realizes that in taking 5-MeO, even in the best circumstances, could be a bit of a risk for me. And he says, I really do not want to risk having another psychosis, let alone ending up in a permanent state of psychosis. But
Mm.
what do you think? And he also says, I understand you're not a doctor, and I understand you're not a psychiatrist, and you don't want to give medical advice, but he's curious. So this is exactly what we're talking about here. That here's someone who has had a history of psychosis, but is still very curious about the experience, yet also wary of, might this send me into another psychotic episode? And here the hard answer is, well, yes, it might. And, but, okay, so here's another example. This is a woman I spoke with earlier this week, someone who had never exhibited any psychosis, never exhibited any suicidal tendencies in any capacity. She could go through all the medical screening in the world, answer all the questionnaires, and she would have come out as, okay, this is a good candidate.
Yeah. Yeah.
She had 5-MeO, and she said that she ended up in the facilitator's kitchen with a butcher's knife, and the facilitator had to tackle her to prevent her from stabbing herself.
Wow. Okay.
Had never, ever
No.
anything like that before. So this is where medical screening is only going to get us so far.
Yes.
And this is where even with someone who passes and says, okay, this person is a good candidate, this is why we still need to have really conscientious facilitation, because you never know. And this goes back to something that I've been harping on ever since 2008, is that I like to say, regardless of what your prior experience is, regardless of what your mental health is, regardless of your physical state, regardless of what you say you're looking for with 5-MeO or not, regardless of how well you think you're able to surrender, relax, let go or not, your first full release dose of 5-MeO is the diagnostic round. Because now we know your ego has been put into the most absolute crisis it could ever be in. Were you able to let go, or were you not able to let go? And if you weren't able to let go, then what happened? What arose? And now, regardless of the narrative you're telling yourself about who you are, how healthier you are, anything, now we have a dramatic embodiment and representation of, this is what's going on inside you. You didn't know it. I didn't know it. Nobody else knew it. Now we know, because you've gone through this event. And so now we can diagnose, this is a fundamental issue for you.
Yes.
But in my experience, there are no good predictors for that. No amount of questionnaires, interviews, or evaluations is really going to reveal that until it actually happens. And so start from there. So really the biggest thing with 5-MeO is that so let's first go to the ideal case. The ideal case is somebody takes a hit and they just go and then 20 minutes later
they're back in the room.
Thank you. Okay, that's a lovely ideal case. But
does that happen sometimes?
Yes, it does. It does. And sometimes that can happen consistently across various people. And so this is a big problem for facilitators, because if they've only ever seen people do that, then their expectation is like, oh, that's how 5-MeO works. But that's just the ideal case. So there's so much energy involved in 5-MeO that it is often the case that bodies will need to physically process and enact and act out that energy. So in other words, it becomes very, very somatically expressed.
Yes.
And there may or may not be a conscious ego present with whom you can reason with.
Yes.
And in most cases, there simply isn't. So there's no conscious ego there. And the person doesn't know what they're doing. And it's like, I jokingly say this is like energetic shock therapy for the ego, where it's like you're plugging into this universal socket of like this infinite amount of energy. And it's normal for the body to spaz, to convulse, to do really big dramatic movements. And
Mm.
I've seen people do flips. I mean, just
Wow.
incredible athletic feats. And then also, if somebody is fighting with it, it tends to get very explosive. There could be a lot of side to side movement. Um, People can act out in a way that is destructive, either to themselves or to others or to objects in the room. People can act out, they can get caught into an ego projection and narrative,
Mm.
meaning that they're using other people in the room as characters in their story and they act out the story without realizing that they're acting out the story. So,
Yeah.
my best example of that from when I was facilitating is I had this guy, he explained all of this to me later. At the time, I didn't know what was going on, but he took a hit and he laid down and he was there for like 10 minutes. But at the 10-minute mark, he suddenly popped up and he ran at me, pushed me into the ground, dug his knees into my shoulders, and then started smashing his fist into my face as hard as he possibly could, clearly trying to collapse my skull and kill me. And then he couldn't hear me as I was saying no. When I said the word
Mm.
enough, somehow that snapped him out of that. And then he went into another projection and started begging me to go get the gun, put it to my head, pull the trigger, and kill me. Do it now.
Whoa.
Now, he later explained to me that he received a message that to prove himself worthy, he either had to kill the demon sitting across from him or let the demon kill him. That's what was going on in his mind.
Mm.
Now, during this, he was lying there. I was just sitting and watching. There was nothing else
Mm.
happening. But
Mm.
this is how rapidly and totally the ego can create a narrative and then start acting on it compulsively. So
Yeah.
there's always the danger of some kind of physical event or physical danger. Sometimes people do need to be restrained for
Mm.
their own well being and the well
Mm.
being of others. Um, and that there's no possibility during these events for them to either give consent or take consent away. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like when, if you go in for surgery and if you're going to be anesthetized, when you're under anesthesia, you have no agency.
Yeah.
And we accept that as part of the process of going in and having surgeries. Like, yes, I've consented to have this surgery. I expect to come out okay on the other side. Yes, I understand that some people occasionally don't wake up from anesthesia, so this is a risk of death. I also understand that maybe the doctor will do something wrong and like sew a piece of medical equipment up into me, and then I can sue
Yes.
that doctor for malpractice. But I understand that, and this is the same thing that when we are agreeing to work with 5-MeO, that we are agreeing that there's going to be time periods where we are not under our own conscious control, where we have no agency, we have no capacity to either give or remove consent, and that we are putting ourselves in the hands of facilitators whose job is to
Mm.
maintain that we are safe and secure during that time period, and that nobody else is hurt,
Mm.
and that this is part of the ego dissolution process. And this
Mm.
is where 5-MeO, I mean, these kind of things can show up with other psychedelics, but it tends to be rare.
Mm.
Versus 5-MeO, this is a normal part of working with 5-MeO. And that
Mm.
everyone who's working with it and facilitating or receiving it, they need to understand this.
Mm.
Because when it's not understood, then people will claim that things have been done to them.
Mm.
So, for example, if because people do tend to move around a lot, it's not just boom, I'm out and
Yeah.
then I'm back
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. It is
And
energetic, as you say. Yeah.
that's very energetic. So, if
Yeah.
somebody, quote, wakes up on the other side of the room, they're bleeding,
Yeah.
they might think, I have just been abused.
Mm.
This is also why I do recommend that people video record sessions so that you
Yeah.
can
I was
go
going to
back and
ask
say,
actually. Yes. Yeah.
no, This is you thrashing about,
Yes.
taking off your clothes, beating the wall, slamming your head into the ground. No one did this to you.
Mm,
This was you. But this is also why we need facilitators who are willing to step in, and I'm going to hold you down
mm,
and make sure
mm,
you don't hurt yourself or anyone
mm.
else.
Yeah.
Um, and this is where, in my experience, there really, again, is no way to predict this. So, again, this is part of the diagnostic.
Hmm.
It,
Hmm.
so some people like to use this model of we're going to give you small doses and work up to the large dose so that we can get a
Mm,
sense of how you're able to navigate the experience, how you're able to embody it, and this will make it easier when you get to that full release experience. In my opinion, that's nonsense because the full release dose is so categorically, fundamentally distinct from anything that comes before that. No
mm,
amount of small doses or medium doses is really going to tell us what's going to happen when this person has a
mm,
full release dose and either dissolves the ego or doesn't.
mm.
That's why it's the diagnostic round. And at that point, then we know, okay, this person's a runner, this person's a fighter, this person's a
Yes.
screamer, this person's a stripper, or oh, this person's a Buddha. This person is just going to lie back with a big smile on their face, and that's all they're going to do.
Mm.
Again, I think it's both.
Yeah.
And it really comes down to where the person addressing the question is comfortable kind of laying their allegiance in the sentence. So
Yeah.
your standard psychiatrist or psychologist, or even just your standard therapist, would probably say, yes, this is the temporary loss of the self-reference model, and that this is a very interesting and unique brain state, and it has certain therapeutic applicabilities, and that's totally valid, that we don't need to go to the ontological level. However, for those of us who are interested in the deep philosophical questions,
Mm,
seems to reveal the deep ontological structure of the nature of being and the nature of reality.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
even if you are just a standard psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist, your clients are going to be coming back to you with like, I think I just experienced God. And no
Yeah.
amount of, well, that's an interesting psychological state in
Yeah.
the absence of the self-reference model of the ego. It's like, no, 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 this was God. I'm trying to tell
Mm,
you, like, this was God.
mm,
Um, this is where my argument is if you're going to work with people with 5-MeO, you don't need to believe any of this stuff. But
mm.
A, you definitely have got to have your own experience with 5-MeO
100%.
because otherwise you are not going to be able to relate to what your clients are saying.
No.
Because it's going to because that those psychological models are going to come in and say, "Ooh, the delusions of grandeur" or something like that.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I'm just trying to tell you, like this is what my experience was,
Yeah.
and that I think beyond the psychological model is so. Let's put it this way: from a neurobiological model, we could say when I say I love someone and I really feel that, I'm releasing oxytocin in my body, right?
Mm, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we have a biochemical correlate for the
Mm,
experience of love. And here a common descriptor with the full release experience of 5-MeO is this sense of overwhelming, oceanic sense of unconditional love, forgiveness, and acceptance
mm,
that is transformative.
yeah.
So when we say, well, look, I'm in a loving relationship with my partner and I really love her and I feel that love, if someone were to say, oh, yeah, well, that's just oxytocin, it's like, you're not really grabbing the essence of what I'm talking about here.
Hmm.
This is a
Hmm.
direct human experience that is
Mm,
profound. And
mm,
so here we're dealing with that magnified
Yeah.
by like an infinite degree. So from the experiential perspective, I think for the vast majority of people, the strict psychological interpretation is just not going to land as satisfying.
No.
And therefore, I do think it's best for, and this is particularly on the integration side, because this is where people bring their questions about all of this, is that, like I've set out, anybody who offers integration with 5-MeO-DMT, you must have experience with it.
Mm.
You must have an understanding of what is the non-dual experience. And you
Hmm.
need to have a working theory of how does the ego interact with or resist or dissolve into the non-dual experience. And then how is this embodied and processed through the vehicle of through which the ego itself is expressed, which is the body.
Mm.
And so that you need to have at least a functional, non-dual theory of the nature of reality and the nature of being in order to even talk to people about their 5-MeO experience.
Mm.
So this is something that, so I don't facilitate anymore, but I do offer integration for people.
I
Majority of my
see.
clients are people with 5-MeO. Most people who reach out to me say, I don't know who else I can talk to about this.
Hmm.
Often they even say, I don't even feel like I can talk to my facilitator about it because my facilitator just isn't experienced enough.
Mm.
Or, and they definitely say, I can't talk to my therapist, I can't talk to my psychiatrist because they can't relate.
Yeah.
They can't help me make sense of this. And
Yeah.
that I also think it's very important that even if we do develop what we could call like a God theory of the nature of being and the nature of reality, that I also like to say I myself, and personally, I'm not religious and I'm not spiritual. That I think that these are different things.
Mm.
Religion and spirituality are egoic constructs and practices and systems of identity. I like to say, like, working with 5-MeO DMT, this is just reality therapy. That's all that it is. This is the
I like that.
reality that there is
Like,
this one universal consciousness and being that is everyone and everything. And if you want to be religious about that, you can.
yeah.
That's just something for your ego to do, that this is not a religious statement. This is an
Mm.
ontological and phenomenological statement.
Mm.
This is something we experience as the fundamental nature of being and reality. And this is what people who have a 5-MeO experience, they want to be able to talk to someone at this level and
Yeah.
not being told like, well, that's just a projection of your consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's kind of different for every person. It really depends on what's going on with them.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so so this is the way that I structure integration. Um, Understanding that I'm mostly dealing with people pretty soon after their experience,
Mm.
and tends to be a somewhat tumultuous time period for people. But sometimes it's people who are much further out. So I do like to distinguish that when we're talking about integration, that we could kind of distinguish from immediate aftercare versus long-term changes, long-term goals, long-term therapy, and
Mm.
behavioral changes and things like that.
Mm.
But for the immediate sense, which again, this is mostly what I get in terms of clients, it's more of kind of a crisis management in a sense of um, like I say, the big things that people tend to come with is they want help understanding what in the world did I just go through? Like this blew my mind. Then they want help understanding what's happening to me now because we get a lot of after effects, has a deep, deep impact on people afterwards. And then also then there's the question of like, what can I do with it? What is
Mm.
what
Mm.
how do I integrate and make sense of this?
Yeah.
Um, and that a big part of that is helping people understand what is showing up energetically and somatically within their experience, reactivations, ongoing.
Yeah, I was going to ask about reactivations. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Go on.
Yeah. Um, Here's a quick little backstory about reactivations. So
Mm.
um, after this was probably February of 2008, I had my second full experience with 5-MeO. And the next day, I sat down to meditate. And, I was just doing my Zen meditation. I sat down and didn't normally do this, but for some reason I felt like just saying Om.
Mm.
Because, I was following Zen meditation. You don't usually Om with Zen meditation. But anyway, I sat down and I was, oh, I'm going to say Om. And as I was saying Om, there was this sensation of I could follow this all the way back. And
Wow.
so then it just went all the way into 5-MeO. I was
Mm.
just in this non-dual 5-MeO state. I think by the clock was probably by like 20 minutes or so. And that somewhere in there, I think around 20 minutes, suddenly my ego popped in as like, I have no idea how to get back. And then I started like convulsing and vibrating. And then, I had this whole nother event. I fell off my cushion and I'm like convulsing on the ground. But then
Wow.
as it all settled down, my legs started swinging up into the air and I was like rolling around in a state of ecstasy. And then when all that finished, I mean, I was just ecstatic. It's like, oh my God, I've never had a meditation even anywhere close to anything like this. And I called up the person who had served me. I got him on the phone and I just blurted like, dude, I just went back in. He's like, what do you mean? It's like, I just had a full on endogenous release of 5-MeO DMT and I had a full on 5-MeO experience. And he's like, oh, I'm jealous. Um, so I called it like, well, this is some kind of spontaneous endogenous 5-MeO DMT release.
Mm.
And the person I told it to, he's like, well, that's really wordy. And, and we don't really know if you're producing 5-MeO DMT. I know it seemed like and he said, let's just call those reactivations.
Mm. Mm.
Okay, that's good.
Mm.
So
Mm.
that's where that comes from. So that's, and at the time, nobody talked about having reactivations this way. So this was brand new. And then it was a couple months later that the woman who is now my wife, she had her first couple of experiences with 5-MeO. And then when her first experience, we weren't together as a couple, but then by the time her second or third, we were a couple.
Mm.
And I forget if it was her second or third, but at one point I woke up at 2 a.m. in the morning and I found her in the shower, hunched down in the shower eating grapes. I was like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm having a reactivation and I'm trying to make it stop. And that was the first person that I had ever seen having this experience around between 2 and 3 a.m. in the morning. And then once was aware of that and started asking other people, became aware that, oh, this is a common time period between 2 and
Mm.
3 a.m. People are having, and then that came to be called night school. But this is all through these early explorations of 5-MeO with me and my friends and colleagues. So anyway, back to the integration question. So part of it, helping, so there's all this energetic embodiment stuff that's going on, all this somatic processing. But a
Mm.
huge, huge part that I like to say for my role as an integration guide, a massive part of it is being a good listener and providing people with the opportunity to talk about it. And
Mm.
that really allowing for, if people are really close to the direct experience with 5-MeO, there's an excellent chance that merely talking about it is going to produce sensations of reactivations, that they will
Mm.
start to re-experiencing that. So it's
Yeah.
providing a safe, grounded environment where they are met with understanding, compassion, and ultimately neutrality of, oh, we're having a Zoom call and you're going back in? Great. I'm just going to sit here with you while that
Mm.
happens. Oh, it's
Mm.
triggering all this emotional output? Great. Um, and that people, whether they have the words for it or not, they are going to want to talk about it. And this is where, after the fact, people start using these phrases of, unconditional love and infinity and God and being. And usually people will say, I used these words before, but
Yes.
I have a totally different understanding of what they actually mean now.
Mm,
And when they come
mm,
to me and they use those words, I'll say, yeah, I totally get what you're talking about because
hmm.
I've been through it. I've had the experience. So people want to be able to talk about it with someone who can relate to it. And this is one of the most profound ironies of 5-MeO, which I think is just, it's both kind of fun and just, it's bizarre, where I've said for years that the experience of being one with everything, like truly being one with everything, not just having the idea I'm one with everything or the beliefs that I'm one with everything, but truly being one with everything in this direct
Mm,
immediate experience, there actually is no more socially isolating experience a human being can have. Because when the ego returns back from that, you become acutely aware most people have never had this experience. And when I try
mm,
and talk to them about it, they're going to think I'm crazy or they're going to
mm.
dismiss me or they're going to say, like, oh, well, what an interesting belief you have. But I'm
Yeah.
not talking about a belief, I'm talking about a direct experience. So that because it's so isolating, many people who have the experience are kind of fundamentally desperate to talk about it and to have
Hmm.
it be received and listened to and heard by someone who can relate and someone who can understand. And that's where there's a definite shortage, that there are a lot more people facilitating 5-MeO and experiencing 5-MeO than there are qualified people to
Mm,
really sit around and listen to people and say, yeah, tell me your story.
mm.
Let's talk about it. And I can give you grounded, relevant reflection and advice for how
Yeah.
best to integrate it and how to work with it. Because more people are getting experience with it at this point,
Mm,
a lot more people in the psychedelic world that can relate and can say, oh, yeah,
mm.
I've had Bufo, I've had 5-MeO. In
Yeah.
comparison, like in 2008, when I was going through my process, there was no one,
Yeah,
anyone
I bet.
to talk to. And that when I started using the phrase, this is the God molecule, people were so pissed off and so angry, like, oh, how dare you use that word? And how dare
Oh,
you say
really?
that this experience is more powerful than DMT? Everybody knows that DMT is the most powerful psychedelic on the planet. And that, oh, you have delusions of grandeur, like you're turning into megalomaniac. And it's like, oh, like this, I'm trying to tell you, like, this is what's really going on. So I
Mm,
think there's a lot more people that can relate, but it's
yeah.
still limited. And so
Yeah.
for um, people who haven't experienced 5-MeO, it's still very hard for them to relate to it, even if they have a lot of experience with other psychedelics.
Yes.
Yeah, so these are definitely really important questions. And
Mm,
so this is where, for example, like me as who I am, what I like to recommend is like, okay, read my books, listen to my talks.
hmm.
For anybody who wants to facilitate, like you got to know what you're doing. And I
Yeah.
also strongly recommend that people make sure that they are not imposing their religious or spiritual beliefs on the people that they work with. It really rubs me the wrong way when I get an integration client who says, oh, yeah, well, my facilitator told me that this was my karma, or I was cleansing a past life, or I had some kind of entity attached to me. Um,
Whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
like in the psychedelic field, this is where I lean heavily towards, I would, even if somebody is working off of a strict psychological model, I would choose that over a ceremonial model any
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because there's less likely to be that imposition of these are my metaphysics, these are my beliefs, these are my
Yeah.
spiritual ideals. Um, but we do see a lot of this in the facilitation world, that there are 5-MeO churches, Bufo
Mm,
churches, where, oh, it's the spirit of the toad. We've got to say these prayers. So I like to promote this idea of energetic neutrality. Um, I also think that there can be a tendency among people in the psychedelic world who facilitate to um, give interpretation,
Yes.
along these lines. So like this is where I like to use myself as a model. That when I was working and I had a client say, "Wow, I felt this energy release," and they would ask me, "What is that?"
Mm.
My answer was always, "Oh, it's just energy." And then often people would say, "But did you have any visions? Did you have any downloads? Did you have any interpretations?" I was like, "No, it's just energy." Okay. I'm not going to give you an interpretation. I'm not going to tell
Mm.
you a story. But I've been harping on this for years now that storytelling, meaning making, and the imposition of metaphysics into these experiences, I think is rather endemic in the psychedelic world. So that again,
Mm.
that's why I like to see a more neutral therapeutic approach
Mm.
where people are really ethically trained, like, don't do that.
Yeah. Don't
Don't
get in the
provide.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, So I think that that's really, really important for people to check themselves and to ask themselves, like, am I being neutral? That's a fundamental question for people to ask. And then in the actual facilitation, um, it really can depend on the context. Like I've seen, again, like churches and almost cult-like groups
Yeah.
form,
Yeah.
and then there's a lot of reliance on the facilitator as a guru kind of figure,
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm the one with all the answers, follow my guidance. Um, and I think that it takes people to be too honest and kind of check with themselves, like, am I doing that or am I not doing that?
Mm.
Be
Mm.
open to feedback. That's where we can have, various forms of peer review and peer accountability. This is a big part. I teach this. I'm one of the primary teachers for the 5-MeO facilitation course with Mindscape, and that's one of our whole sections is like how not to be a guru, how
Yes.
how not to run a cult. Uh, but it's tricky because my spiritual and religious neutrality is fairly absolute. I have really strict boundaries around that, but I do notice that in teaching students, many of them come with a lot of these beliefs and
Mm.
a lot of this understanding because, again, it's rather endemic. I think, particularly in the United States, where there's a
Mm.
lot of intermixing between New Age and psychedelics.
I
This,
see. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
they've been culturally coupled for quite a while.
Yeah.
So people come in with a lot of um, just assumptions where, again, I've been dealing with this for years, where people assume if you're into psychedelics, you probably believe in karma, you probably believe in past
Mm.
lives, you probably believe in reincarnation, you probably believe in spirits, you probably
Mm.
believe in Akashic records, you probably believe in astrological signs, you probably believe in chakras, um, you probably believe all of this stuff. And so this is where I've been an outlier. Is like, I don't believe any of that stuff.
Mm.
Not a single of those things that I just mentioned do I believe.
Mm.
And so bringing those assumptions that my clients are going to believe this or that this is going to be relatable for them, this is where I just like to, as much as I can convince other people just to cut it out, like, okay, even if you have those beliefs, like, don't bring that into the session with your
Yeah.
clients. You've
Yeah.
got to have a therapeutic neutrality. Or the opposite is, if you can't do that, then just open up a church or
Yeah. Exactly.
like
Yeah.
really be upfront about it that
Yeah.
I am bringing these metaphysical beliefs
Mm.
into my practice so that
Mm.
people can know who and what they're working with. And that then they can make a choice like, oh, do I like this more therapeutically oriented facilitator
Yeah.
versus this more spiritually oriented facilitator?
Yeah.
A lot of people who do that, they're not intentionally being malicious or harmful.
No.
They're just assuming like, oh no, this is the way that it works. Like everybody
Mm.
believes in this stuff. And so I'm just
Mm.
sharing with you. So, I mean, the things that I've seen is really exactly along those examples that I've given, where I've had clients say, yeah, my facilitator said I had an entity attached to me and I needed to be depossessed. Or, yeah, my whole trauma, that was trauma from a past life. And so now I'm trying to integrate that. Or even when people say, yeah, I recalled memories of a past abuse or a past trauma, and that my
Mm,
facilitator reaffirmed that they saw it too and that that's what it was. And that's where I like to say, look, nothing that comes up in a psychedelic experience is necessarily connected to anything that ever previously happened. It can just be a representation of what you're feeling and perceiving and thinking and feeling in that very moment.
mm,
So that's why I'm really suspicious of anybody claiming memories of a past trauma. Like somebody saying, you know
mm,
what? I think maybe my dad abused me when I was 2 in the crib. It's like,
mm.
I'm not going to be able to confirm that. Now,
No,
we
yeah,
can say, did you have that experience now? Did you
yeah,
have emotions and sensations and feelings associated with that now? And are you processing that now? Yes. Do we know that that happened when we were 2? No.
mm,
This is where is that really strong challenge of don't claim anything that you don't know with 100% certainty. But there's so much pressure to conform things into these spiritual narratives in the psychedelic world that people just, they do it without thinking. Um, like on my podcast, I interview so many people, and people just routinely they bring up all this stuff as though I should just agree with them. And I usually don't
really.
push back like on my podcast, but that's where like my hope is that anybody who wants to be interviewed on my podcast, please at least do a little bit of research about me so that you know that if you come on my podcast and start talking about past lives and all the rest of the stuff, I'm going to change the topic on you.
Mm, mm,
But it's the assumption. And there's
yeah,
also the assumption that this is what spiritual maturity is. So that I'm
yeah,
mature, I'm sophisticated,
yeah, yeah,
I know all of this stuff. Um, and there's also a strong tendency to be accommodating. And I think that it can also be the role of this facilitator to challenge people. Like, so if you have a client that says, wow, I just recalled a past life, you could say, do you know that's fundamentally true?
yeah,
No. But
yeah,
there's this sense of, oh, I've got to respect everybody's beliefs. Everybody's opinion or perspective is equal. And I've always taken the position like, no, there's a difference between being an expert in something versus just like
mm,
having an opinion. And
mm,
that,
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
yeah, and that an experience is just means you had an experience. It doesn't
yeah,
mean that there was an experience of something that was true.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I've always been of the opinion that I think using toad secretions is just fundamentally unnecessary.
Mm,
And here actually is where we tend to rub people the wrong way with their spiritual beliefs. So,
mm,
something that I've never heard somebody who works with synthetic say is synthetic fundamentally works and toad secretions don't work. I've never heard anybody who works with synthetics say that. But I've heard the opposite many, many times of people who
yeah,
toad who say, no, this is organic, it's natural, and there's the spirit of the toad that
mm,
this works in a way that synthetic simply cannot because this has
yeah,
spiritual properties that are essential to it. And this is where I've tried to be very direct and say, okay, that is a belief of your ego, nothing
mm,
more.
mm,
There's no reality to that whatsoever.
mhm,
Because working with synthetic 5-MeO is perfectly effective. And
yeah,
I've put out the challenge that if we just based off of a description or even just based off of an observation, if we
mm,
don't know if somebody is being served bufo or synthetic, we
yeah,
never know
you won't know, yeah,
because the phenomenological results are the
mm-hmm,
same. They're identical.
mm-hmm,
But it's a belief that toad is better. So some people will insist on only working with toad for religious and spiritual purposes. and that's a construct of their ego. And I
Mm.
don't like that. I mean, if people say, like, I want to work with Toad, okay, I don't know if the toads are so thrilled about that.
Yes.
Then
Yeah.
we get into all these ecological and questions. Um, but synthetic is perfectly workable. It's highly effective. My preference then is for serving people with synthetic because one of the limitations of working with Toad is that we can never be precise. It's
Yeah.
always a matter of guesswork. How much
Mm.
5-MeO is this person actually getting?
Mm.
Now, even within the precise measurement of molecular weight, I do like to emphasize results are still going to vary. So we can't be completely mechanical that, oh, you got this number of milligrams, you should get this kind of experience. There's still going to
Mm.
be a lot of variability, but at least then we are able to accurately adjust and measure.
Yes.
Um, and
Yeah.
overall, I think that the experience with pure molecule tends to be a little bit cleaner. Like often in this, people who have had both Toad and pure molecule will often describe the pure molecule as smoother and less jagged, that as a
Mm.
phenomenological description,
Mm.
um, and that it's easier to inhale, especially if we're doing vaporization. It's easier to
Yeah.
inhale a sufficient amount, and therefore it's more functionally, it's better suited for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what I also like about the synthetic is that that opens up the possibility for all of these other routes of administration. If people want to do that with, I can do an injection, I can do nasal, I can do
Mm.
anal. I don't ever recommend anal, but some people like that. But you can't do that with Toad. Like you can only smoke it or vaporize it. So
Mm.
it opens up more therapeutic possibilities, more routes of administration, more careful measurement, and it works. So the only reason you wouldn't use synthetic is if you have some kind of egoic hangup.
Mm.
It must be Toad. And so I
Yeah.
just think that that's an invalid argument. It just doesn't
Yeah.
hold any water for me. Yeah. I think the biggest thing that's misunderstood about it is, here I'm going to give my example of me. Um, my first full experience with 5-MeO in January of 2008, my immediate sense was, oh my God, this is the easiest and most profound psychedelic molecule that exists that anyone could ever possibly work with, because all you need to do is take a hit, and
Mm.
within a few seconds, it's nothing but God. And that is amazing. This is the experience I've been looking for my entire life, but I had no idea that this is what it was. And that is so profound. It has completely changed my perspective about the
Mm.
nature of reality, the nature of being. And
Mm.
it's so easy. Just
Yeah.
give someone a hit. And
Yeah.
so I later came to use this expression of, I had what I like to call the divine grace experience, where
Mm-hmm.
I was in the perfect place in my life so that there was no resistance, there was no hesitancy,
Mm.
there was no grappling with it, and I was
Mm.
ready and willing to completely let go and dissolve into the most profound experience a human being could have.
Mm.
And then my mistaken notion was, oh, it could do this for anyone, anytime. And that my second experience was different. So I was, okay, well, that's interesting. But then I was being served in this group ceremonial context where every person had their own turn. So everybody else is like sitting around and watching and holding space and observing as somebody else
Oh,
was doing.
wow. Okay.
And so through that, that's where I started to kind of map out, like, oh, there are so many different ways that the ego might resist or get in the way or indulge or hold on. And
Mm.
that, yes, other people are having the same experience I had, but it's definitely not everyone. And it's
Mm.
definitely not right away. Some people have to go
Mm.
through a lot of stuff before they have that experience.
Mm.
Some people never have that experience. I still think that that is the highest potential of the experience, but there's such a huge range, and that the dissolution of the ego is not automatic. Um, and even me giving it the name of the God molecule is potentially misleading if somebody thinks like, okay, so that means I just take it and I instantly experience reality as God, and it's all loving and it's all beautiful and it's so profound that I'm brought to tears. Like, yeah, that's the potential. So I think that while the positive potential of 5-MeO is really widely understood,
Mm,
the potential harrowing, traumatic, and really difficult and challenging experiences where the
mm,
ego is not able to let go
mhm,
and fights with it, that's not as widely understood. And so, like, when in my integration work, it's fairly regular. First of all, it's somewhat self-selecting, right? Somebody who just had an amazing time and it's super easy, they're not going to be like, I need to talk to someone. So
yeah, yeah.
I get a lot of the people who are like, oh my God, I need to talk to someone. And what often happens is if somebody has had a difficult or challenging experience, or maybe their ego didn't let go and they experience this as traumatic, most people, they blame themselves. Say,
Mm,
I did something wrong.
mhm,
Or they think that somehow they deserved that experience, for whatever reason,
mm,
or they think that they've broken an expression that a lot of people use is, I think I broke my brain.
yeah.
So they feel that now they've done like some kind of damage to themselves. And they also might say, like, this was the worst decision of my life to do this. And so that's where I lean heavily towards going back to what I was saying before, the full disclosure and informed consent, that it's very
Mhm.
important that, like, I've had people tell me that, yeah, my facilitator said, oh, yeah, everybody loves this. Everybody just has a beautiful experience. It's like,
Oh, wow.
I
Okay.
wish facilitators would stop telling people that.
Yeah, yeah,
It's not true.
yeah,
So people are going into it uninformed, and that I want
yeah.
people to be more informed and more educated. And then also, I've had both facilitators and clients say, so on the facilitator side, sometimes they say, well, I don't tell my potential clients much about it because I don't want to predispose them to have any kind of beliefs around it. And then
Okay.
I've also had the clients say, I intentionally didn't learn anything about it because I didn't want to be influenced by anybody else's perspective or opinion. And it's just like, oh God, I wish you hadn't have done that, because
Yeah,
you've worked with the biggest experience possible for a human being to
yeah,
have. There isn't anything bigger than this, and you've treated it casually.
yeah, yeah,
And that's where I want people to be educated about it,
yeah,
have an
yeah.
understanding. What am I really getting myself into? And also the fact that it's now widely also understood that it's a relatively brief experience. And so people think like, wow, okay, 20, maybe 40
Yeah,
minutes,
I'll go back to work.
and then back to work. I can handle that. Versus this is an experience that can transform the rest of your life.
Hmm.
Or it might be something that you deeply traumatically regret for the rest of your
Mm,
life,
mm,
that it's going to keep impacting you for a significant period afterwards.
yeah.